Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about some of the research that I've been working on in the last few years. As Chinny said, my name's Sarah McGeown, and I'm Professor of Literacy at the University of Edinburgh. And for almost, I suppose, over a decade now, I've been looking at the concepts of reading motivation and engagement. But I'd say it's only really in the last few years that I've begun to have some sort of clarity about what reading engagement is and its central role in children and young people's reading experiences and outcomes. And I'm really looking forward to some of the discussion later on about this. So in terms of what we mean by reading engagement, I think that the research field in some ways has been has really lacked a sort of conceptual clarity of what we mean by this term. And a few years ago, there was a systematic review of reading engagement research, and I was really grateful for this systematic review coming out, because what it really highlighted was that actually researchers are using the term reading engagement in lots of different ways. Very often they're not defining what they mean when they use the term reading engagement. And I think the term reading engagement tends to be quite synonymous with behavioural engagement, which I'll talk about in a second. But for example, volitional reading, leisure time reading, when actually children's reading experiences and outcomes are influenced by a much broader range of types of engagement. So what I'm going to do is talk through these 4 different dimensions of engagement now. We're really interested to hear people's thoughts on this afterwards. But following the systematic review, I contacted one of the authors and said that I was interested in further refining what we mean by these different dimensions of reading engagement, and also developing a tool in order to assess children's motivation, children's engagement in relation to books. And so we've done this. We've collected data in the UK. The measure, as far as I understand it, has actually been translated into different languages for use in other contexts. And Chinny has also been leading some data collection in Singapore as well to understand reading engagement within your own context. So in terms of what we mean by behavioural engagement reflects children's reading behaviours. That is, how frequently children read, which is typically what's looked at when we think about volitional reading or leisure time reading. But it's not just about frequency of reading, it's also about duration of reading. And often the longer that children or young people read for, the greater the likelihood that they will become immersed in what they're reading. Behavioural engagement also reflects the breadth of their reading behaviours as well. So for example, if we think about books, whether it's a child who's focused only on a single author or genre, or whether they're reading more widely than that, whether they read only fiction or non-fiction, the breadth of their reading activities are going to have an impact on their experiences and outcomes. Type is really important too. We can think about, for example, traditional books, but also digital texts as well, and the impact that this can have on reading experiences and outcomes. And also thinking about patterns of reading activities too. So if we think about books, for example, these fiction books tend to be read in quite a linear way. But we know that when children read non-fiction books or engage with different digital texts, often you see different reading behaviour profiles as well, which again will have consequences for their reading experiences and their outcomes. So behavioural engagement, as I'm developing my understanding of it, really encapsulates a lot of different types of reading behaviours. Now, in terms of what the research says, it seems to be that how much we read is beneficial for our reading and language skills, for example. Books tend to be particularly important, specifically fiction books, although I'm a big advocate for non-fiction, and I can talk a little about that. But we also know that other types of texts are a part of children and young people's reading activities. So we've just finished a research study, and this was led by my PhD student, Hawla Al-Hamid, who was looking at reading engagement within the context of augmented reality books and how this shifted their engagement. In terms of cognitive engagement, this refers to the level of cognitive effort that readers put in while reading and the extent to which they implement strategies in order to support their comprehension. So when a child is reading, if they're reading with a high level of cognitive engagement, when they come to a word that they don't know, they're more likely to spend time trying to decode and work out that unfamiliar word. If they come to a passage of the text that doesn't make sense, they're more likely to look back and reread in order to resolve their understanding. They're also more likely to make connections between their existing knowledge and what they're reading, thus consolidating previously acquired information. And they'll also perhaps actively be putting into place other cognitive processes, such as drawing inferences as well. And again, there's research that shows the importance of cognitive engagement for reading outcomes. And the study here demonstrated that cognitive engagement actually mediates the relationship between motivation and comprehension. So cognitive engagement is really important for the development of reading and for language skills as well. And we know that teenagers, for instance, are less likely to want to read books. And at least in the UK, when they do read books, often the books that they read have quite simple or simpler reading and language. So we need to think about developing children and young people's motivation to want to read more complex books as well in order to develop reading and language skills. Affective engagement refers to the quality, type, and depth of emotions experienced while reading. It can include lots of different processes. For example, that feeling of immersing oneself in a book, relating personal experiences to text content. For example, as a child or young person sees aspects of themselves, their lives, or experiences reflected in what they read. It can be actively using one's imagination in order to enhance the book, or empathizing with characters, for example. And I think what this demonstrates is that although I'm talking about behavioural, cognitive, affective, and social engagement as being separate constructs, actually there's a lot of connections between these as well, because there's a lot of cognitive processes that need to go on for children to experience some of these emotions or experience this level of affective engagement, for example, empathy or use of imagination. But there is beginning to be a body of research which is looking at the well-being benefits that come from reading books. And I just like to stress that affective engagement and emotional engagement isn't always about happy emotions. Very often children or young people can be drawn towards books which can elicit feelings of sadness, feelings of personal reflection, of introspection. Sometimes books can give quite unsettling feelings, feelings of tension as well. So it's really about recognizing the diversity of emotional experiences that children and young people can have with books and the ways in which these can enrich them. And finally, social engagement refers to participation in reading activities for others. And this can take different forms. It may be book talk, reading together, recommending or sharing books. This may be with peers, with friends, with family members, with teachers, or with others. But ensuring that children and young people have opportunities to engage in these social activities in ways which are personally meaningful and valuable to them, and that in ways which they feel comfortable and confident in is also really important. And we know that social engagement also has an opportunity to extend children and young people's understanding or thinking of a text as well, as they more deeply read books if they know that they're going to share them, or they understand other people's perspectives on books too. And of course, social engagement isn't separate either. The amount of time children spend socially engaging is related to behavioural engagement. The level of cognitive effort and engagement they have during these social reading activities is important. And also the emotional or affective experiences that they have as well similarly illustrate that although these can be seen as separate, they're actually very closely interlinked. And again, although I've been talking about social engagement and all of these within the context typically of books, we can think about social engagement within the context of online reading communities among teenagers, etc., etc. So as I'm developing sort of my thinking around reading engagement, I'm beginning to see that it's actually quite central in terms of our understanding of children's reading experiences and outcomes. For, as I said, the last decade, I've been studying the concept of reading motivation. That is, how we can encourage and inspire children to want to read more books, to be motivated to read. But actually, motivation is just part of it. When they're motivated to read, they also need to then be deeply engaged in the books that they read. And it's this deep level of engagement that leads to the positive outcomes that we see cited within the research literature. In terms of where the research is at present, I would say that there's a lot of empirical research which shows a causal relationship from motivation to these positive outcomes through behavioural and cognitive engagement. But I would say the affective and social engagement is at the moment very much reliant on qualitative research, which I also believe is very important. So it's not to be negative about qualitative research at all. So what are some of the benefits that we can get when children are reading and choosing to engage deeply within the books that they read? Over the last couple of years, we've been leading a research project looking at reading and well-being across the lifespan. And over the last 5 minutes or so, I've been talking about reading engagement in the context of children and young people. But actually, this is a model of reading engagement that I think can and does apply across the entire lifespan, whether we're also thinking about adults or older adults reading too. But I am going to just reflect on some of the benefits of reading engagement now for children and young people. So one of the first is about the kind of the diversity of emotional experiences that readers have when they read. So his first child talking about loving the thrill, the magic of it, and that immersion, I suppose, feeling like they're in another world. And you see here in a sort of affective engagement in response to reading. The second child saying you don't want to put it down because there's another cliffhanger. Again, we see levels of affective engagement there, but also potentially high levels of behavioural engagement as they're choosing to read longer as they're becoming increasingly immersed in the story. And again, recognizing that there's a diverse range of emotional experiences while children and young people read. So one child saying the books have made them feel happy, sad, confused, question themselves, but it's given them that sort of time to think and that emotional vocabulary to be able to talk about their emotions more easily. We also see, and again, there's a huge body of quantitative research, but I'm just going to illustrate it with a couple of quotes around the academic literacy and language skills that can come from reading as well. So a child here recognizing that some of the language and the way things are written within books can also support themselves as writers. And I'm really interested in this connection actually between reading and writing. And then a second child here recognizing that some text types may be better able to support their reading skills than perhaps others. We also know that books can develop children and young people's knowledge of the world and also has the opportunity to expand their life experiences. And I think very often there are stereotypical notions of what different text types can offer, but actually texts can offer readers lots of different things depending on how they're reflecting on them and thinking about them. So there's a child here talking about fiction, but actually being able to learn quite a lot from fiction, because often it has a lot of information in it, for example, with historical fiction. And books can also extend children and young people's life experiences as well. Books introduce us to a much more wider array of people, cultures, environments, contexts than we would ever encounter in our day-to-day lives. And so in that way have this sort of expansion effect too. And we see that in this second quote. Books can also be a source of personal enrichment. When children and young people see aspects of themselves or their lives reflected in what they read, they can help to understand that maybe they're not so alone. They feel a sense of belonging, perhaps a more positive sense of self. We can see here in this first quote a child saying that it's helped them to have empathy for themselves as well. And then the second quote here is about that sort of representation of an experience within a book. So a child saying, when the characters tell you about their personal feelings and you can tell how much it actually relates to you. How I know it's just a book, but sometimes it feels like yourself. And I think this is what's different from fiction and narrative fiction within books compared to narrative fiction, for example, within TV or film, in that books tend to give greater insight into characters' inner worlds. And so in that way, you have a better depth of understanding as to their intentions and their thoughts and their feelings about things as well. Books can also support children and young people's empathy and their perspective taking as well. So when we come back to that idea of expanding life experiences and seeing things from others' perspectives, we see in this quote here, it makes me understand that people are fighting battles that you have no idea about. That kind of representation of struggles or difficulties that some people may have in their lives, and also recognizing that perhaps sometimes their friends have similarly been going through things like that. And then another one about this kind of representation of their own experience. For example, this is in relation to the character. Sometimes I already knew what they were going through and I felt sorry for them. So books can be a really important source for children and young people to develop empathy skills and perspective taking, but only when they're engaging with these books. That is, they're cognitively engaging and they're effectively engaging with these books as well. And books can also be a fantastic way to connect to others as well, whether that's through discussing books, recommending books with each other too. But what I also really like is the second quote when a child says, when I read a book that's like about friendship and stuff, I just see how good that friendship is and I want that to happen with my friends. So it's the idea of these kind of positive relationships that they see within books and wanting to also have that within their own lives as well. So I hope I've been able to convince you that the reading engagement really is central to children and young people's reading experiences and outcomes. A lot of the benefits of books that we've just seen come when children and young people are engaging deeply with the books that they read. And yet reading engagement is a term which is actually rarely discussed or understood. In the UK, where I'm obviously based, the term reading for pleasure is something which has really dominated a lot of the policy and practice discourse. We see other terms such as volitional reading and leisure time reading used quite widely as well. But these are typically synonymous with the idea of behavioural engagement, time spent reading. When really what we also need to be doing is enhancing children and young people's cognitive, affective, and social engagement too. And so I think it's really important that we start to share and develop our understanding of what we mean by reading engagement and the ways in which it may be enacted with different text types and with different readers as well. Reading is associated with a wide range of rich and diverse outcomes, and we hear all the time about the benefits of books for reading skills, for language skills, for empathy, for well-being. But actually, this only comes when children and young people are engaging deeply with the books that they read. And so any practices that we put in place in school really does need to be attending not just to a motivation to read, but also engagement in reading too. And a lot of the research that I do is in research practice partnerships. So I tend to work quite closely with teachers, school leaders, other professionals, a lot of national literacy organisations, or in participatory approaches as well, either with children and young people. And I think that the way in which we sort of further develop our understanding of reading engagement and think about how that can be put into place in classrooms is through this kind of collective and collaborative way of working. So I'd just like to say thank you all for listening. If you're interested in this research or any other research that we have going on, there's a link to the Literacy Lab website there. And if anyone would like to follow up with a conversation afterwards, my email address is here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I mean, I think it's great that, so much of the conversation that we have around here tends to be about, you ought to read more because it's good for proficiency, it's good for comprehension. You need to get better at reading. But, with all the quotes you showed us, listening to children and young people's voices, it's helped to expand the reasons for reading beyond proficiency and comprehension. So now I'm going to pass the time over to Anushka to expand our thinking further. So over to you, Anushka.
Can everybody see my slides?
Yes, we can. And we can hear you clearly too.
Great. So thanks very much for having me. I'll be zooming in on particular types of reading engagement relative to what Sarah said, and also on particular text types. Specifically, the kind of engagement I'll be talking about will be what Sarah would term affective engagement. And I'll be looking at nonfiction or informational text specifically. My name is Anushka Kuzmicova, and I work at Charles University in Prague in Czechia at the Faculty of Social Sciences, the Institute of Communication Studies and Journalism. And excuse me, now my slides are not moving, although they did before. So I'll just stop sharing again. Apologies for that. Now they are. Is that correct?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay. So what I'll be presenting basically is preliminary research within a larger project, and it's based on a collaboration. So I should probably detail my background. So I started out once as a literature scholar, but realized fairly early on that I was primarily interested in reading experience rather than text. So my field is reading scholarship or reading research. And I work very closely in particular with my colleague Marketa Supa, who is my co-author on what I'll be presenting. And her background is media education and children's experiences of media. And I think she would define her field as childhood studies. So we work in the nexus of these two fairly interdisciplinary fields. And I think a hallmark of our joint work together over the past 5 years has been that what we do is we design research tools to enable children's reflections on their own experiences. And these research tools are various props and various research designs that may be based on children manipulating 3D props and picture cards and flashcards that help children reflect on fairly complex experiences, including experiences such as the experience of being absorbed in reading fiction, right? Which I would argue is a fairly elusive phenomenon. But as of this year, we're working on a project that is fully dedicated on children's reading of informational text or informational reading, or nonfiction if you prefer. The project's called Wonder, or Ways of Imagining in Children's Lives with Information Texts, and it's funded by the European Research Council, and I'm the principal investigator on that project. So why would we bother having a 5-year project on children's affective engagement with nonfiction? Well, we realized during our work on fiction that there seems to be something of a deficit status attached to nonfiction, in the sense that the different whole person benefits that are attached to reading in public discourse that are based on research, largely quantitative research, as Sarah mentioned, they tend to be confined to fiction. So for instance, there's this fairly influential paper by Raymond Ma and colleagues called Bookworms versus Nerds, where an experimental design helped sort of tease out some of the whole person benefits of fiction reading as contrasted to nonfiction. And there's other ways of, other instances of nonfiction or informational reading being defined in opposition to fiction. So for instance, in the Pearls student questionnaire, there's a distinction, a conceptual distinction made between reading for fun and reading to find out about things, as though the two were conceptually distinct. So there's this idea that the whole person benefits of reading apply to fiction, whereas nonfiction or informational reading continues to be defined primarily in terms of its academic benefits, such as vocabulary building or expanding subject knowledge, right? But the thing is, when you walk into a random bookstore, pretty much anywhere on the globe, a well-stacked bookstore, obviously, something seems to have happened over the past 2 decades on the publishing market, in the sense that the current nonfiction for children, and not for children only, seems to be breaking the boundaries between fun and finding out, and between informational and other kinds of reading. So there seems to be like a lag between the discourse and nonfiction and the fact that the stuff of nonfiction itself. Also, in research, when nonfiction is thought of as autonomous choice made by children, there's typically this distinction being made between a child choosing nonfiction in contrast to choosing fiction. But when you think about children as whole people, it may be more apt to think of nonfiction as choice rather vis-a-vis all kinds of other activities. So if you consider a child who's very much invested in the subject of football, for the sake of an example, there might be more often making a choice between reading on football and engaging with football in all other different kinds of ways than reading. So playing football, chatting on football, thinking about it, etc., rather than between reading fiction or nonfiction on the topic, right? So our research question for what I'll be presenting is where reading stands in relation to all these other kinds of ways of engaging with a child's real-world interest or interesting or favorite topic, right? And the preliminary research were 20 interviews conducted with children aged 9 to 11 that were home-based. And the design of this research is fairly provided in fair detail in a paper that's already been published in a special issue of Language and Education. So I won't dwell in that in order to be able to give you a more reflective account of the results. But what's important to say here is that the research design consisted of 2 main parts. And during the first part, which took up roughly 1/2 of the interview, the children helped us establish what their favorite subjects were, without being aware that during the rest of the interview, we would zoom in on reading. And this allowed us to treat reading on a par with all the other activities that the children might be engaging with, or through which they might be engaging with their favorite subjects, which really was meant to be the most inclusive way of talking about reading on informational or real-world topics. So once we had established what the children's interests were, all the remaining conversations sort of revolved around those subjects, those topics, and there were some book-centric activities that I can mention some details of later on when I'm discussing the results. Now, the results of these, so once my colleague and I were reading through the transcripts of these interviews, we noticed that most of the participants indeed did some informational reading as part of their engagement with their favorite subject matters, and that there were informational texts present in their lives. But interestingly, they didn't seem to reflect on it as much. It very often happened that our participants undervalued their nonfiction reading, or were, as it were, oblivious to it. So we understood from between the lines of what they were saying that they did engage with nonfiction reading, but for some reason, there were barriers to their being able to reflect on that experience. So my colleague and I decided, when analyzing the data, to look at what the constraints were to the children's reflection on their informational reading. And we found that there were two groups or two sets of constraints. Some were discursive biases concerning reading, mainly amounting to narrow definitions of reading. And some were indeed sort of inherent characteristics of nonfiction reading that made it somewhat difficult for the children to reflect on their experiences. So in what remains of this paper, I'll detail these constraints. So there were three, we defined a set of three biases and two inherent characteristics, and I'll go through them one by one. The first one was the most prominent, something we decided to call the linear fiction book bias. It really conflates several biases into one. And this amounts to the fact that for our participants, largely, reading, at least initially, equaled the reading of print fiction in sustained sittings. And there were numerous examples of this, but I've chosen just one. So in the research, during the interviews, we had children manipulate all kinds of flashcards and props. And for that, I asked this participant, Jan, who is 10 years old, to bring a mat to be able to, for the prop manipulation to be easier. And as a mat, he brought this book, which was a nonfiction book that he told me just before we started the interview session, he told me this was one of his favorites, and it was a nonfiction book on the animals who live in the woods. And then we carried on with our research, and about some 10 minutes later, it had been established that animals were one of his favorite subject matters. And when I asked him whether he ever read about animals, he told me no, that he never did, actually. And only a few minutes later, after some further talking and my broadening of his idea of reading, he was able to convey that, yes, maybe he did read about animals in some encyclopedias and stuff, but his initial idea of reading simply didn't accommodate this kind of text as proper reading. Then there was something we decided to call the words mainly bias, and that had to do with the fact that the children didn't see images as inherent in reading. They felt that image viewing, sort of the studying of images and maybe the captions that went with images in nonfiction text really didn't count toward reading. So for instance, this participant, Anton, who is 10 years old, he told us that his favorite real-world interests were dinosaurs. And he wanted so he was laying out this, as part of the research, he was laying out an imaginary double-page spread in a nonfiction book about dinosaurs. And he had also told us that his favorite way of engaging with dinosaurs was through visual sort of inspection, through viewing them. But when he was laying out his double-page spread, he laid out a very conventional double page in the sense that it was filled with text rather than images. And he only used a tiny image in the corner. And we saw plenty of children who, when it came to sort of thinking about what books would look like, had a very text-centric idea of books and reading. Okay, And finally, the third and last bias that I would want to mention that related to nonfiction text or informational text specifically, and that was this idea that information text was there to be memorized, as it were, or that the facts in text were there to be memorized. So for instance, this participant Marta, 10 years old, when she was flipping through a set of sample books that we'd brought, she would assess the designs of the distinct books, primarily in terms of how much they would help her remember or memorize the stuff. Okay. Now, moving away from the biases and towards what we understood were more like the inherent characteristics of informational reading or nonfiction reading, there was this curious relationship between being able to reflect on one's reading experience in relation to a real-world topic and the sensory accessibility of this topic. So we found that the more sensory, more directly accessible a given area was to the child's senses, such as, I don't know, a topic such as animals or nature, that the children could actually make contact with directly in a non-mediated way, the less likely the children were to be able to reflect on their memories or to be able to recall the memories of actually having read about the topic. Whereas for subject matters that were more remote from the children's direct sensory experience, the children were much more likely to actually remember and reflect on having read about this topic. So even though our participants very likely had read more on topics such as nature or animals in absolute terms, they much more frequently reflected on having read on subjects such as space. But this is just curiosity, more or less. But there was then another inherent characteristic that had more, as it were, practical consequences. And that was the fact that one thing that seemed to prevent children from being able to reflect on their informational reading was something we call the eventness characteristic, namely that the reading of informational text is to a much greater extent than the reading of fiction text is embedded in more complex events that then are the subject of what the children are being able to reflect on, and that somehow sort of overshadow the act of reading as such. And they were of different kinds. So there were practical events, a child, say, reading on how to plant different kinds of plants, but then actually remembering the act of planting the plants rather than having read the instructions on how to plant those plants. There were social events that were very heavily prominent in the sense that children often read informational text for social purposes, to be able to take part in conversation, to be able to entertain others, to be able to, I don't know, engage in social games, etc. But what I want to zoom in on primarily when it comes to the events were something we call the imaginative events, which were of a very complex nature, and which very much sort of deny much of the stereotyping around nonfiction versus fiction. So there was this participant whose pseudonym is Vincent, for instance, who was 10 years old, whose favorite subject or favorite topic was space, who would give us very elaborate, and I'll provide some examples later on, descriptions of the different kinds of imaginative activities that he engaged in, sort of based on what he'd read up about space, even using fairly specific numeric factoid kind of knowledge. There was another boy that we called Tom, 10 years old, who was very much into sports and who'd read a lot about, who engaged frequently in sports news. And he used this experience of having read sports news in inventing an imaginary sport that he sort of engaged in his spare time, using all kinds of props and sort of setting up imaginary tournaments. But back to Vincent, because he was a very prominent example of imaginative events. He would say things such as, it's good to know a lot of stuff about space, because then you can make some things up too. And he described the way he used his reading experiences as follows. He said, I take a piece of information and roll it around in my mind, how things might go or not go, and how we might end up in 1,000 years from now, maybe destroyed by a meteorite or some such. And he would say, I imagine these made-up worlds, and then I go and draw one, and then I go in there, into this imaginative world, and become part of the plot. And there were a lot of sort of numeric details, very, very exact details that related to actual space knowledge in these plots. And he would say things such as, in my book, it would be nice to have some tips on how to build an interstellar freight ship, to transport maggots that are 12 meters long, etc., etc. So there was a lot of sort of fantasy and story-based thinking linked to the expository text that this participant had read on the topic of space. So just circling back to what I started with, that is nonfiction's deficit status. This deficit status seems to be reflected in children's ability to reflect on their informational reading, and some of it is due to how others talk about nonfiction, how the grown-up world has shaped children's ideas about nonfiction and informational reading, namely the discursive biases. And some of this has to do with those inherent characteristics that I mentioned. But the deficit, as far as we were able to glean, is in the reflection, not in the complexity of the experience that the children seem to be having. And there's definitely no support whatsoever to the idea that nonfiction doesn't engage the whole person, and that it doesn't engage a child's social cognition, fantasy, etc., the way it's sometimes pitched. Sort of sometimes there's these ideas that this is what nonfiction lacks vis-a-vis fiction. Well, it doesn't seem to be the case. So with this, I would like to thank you for your attention and say, please stay tuned, because there'll be more research coming out of the research project, because we've only just started and we have 5 years to go.
Thank you so much.